Good evening. Thank you for joining us. A few years ago, Crystal and the kids and I were in Tennessee in a state park out hiking around, and a storm came up. And it was a pretty bad storm. So we found shelter in an old barn that was nearby. It's the only shelter we could find. We climbed up into its loft, and the wind was really strong. The rains were heavy. It was just the rain was coming down in sheets. There was a lot of lightning and thunder. Hail was beating on the roof, and it was pretty deafening. It was scary, but we were okay. And the storm passed, the weather calmed down, went back to our car and went home and went on with our lives. You haven't been through that same scenario, I'm sure, at least not exactly, but you face storms of other sorts, because everyone faces storms, but not everybody is prepared to weather the storms of life. And as Jesus concludes his Sermon on the Mount, he says that the only way to be weatherized is to build your life on him, specifically on the words that he speaks. In Matthew 7, verse 24, let's look at Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Jesus says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Somebody in the Bible who had his share of storms in life was the Apostle Paul. Now, he had a pretty good life as a Pharisee, it seems, but as an apostle, as a minister of Jesus, his life was pretty rough a lot of the time. How could he face persecution by his own Jewish countrymen and by Gentiles, and by how could he face attempts on his life and beatings and lashings? How could he face prisoner and ultimately the executioner's sword with hopeful joy when millionaires who've lost their fortunes sometimes end their own lives in hopeless despair? The difference is that Paul's life was built on a weatherproof foundation. The Apostle Paul had built his life on Christ. And so all of his suffering, all of his persecution, the storms of his life, the deprivations of his life, hunger and thirst and lack of sleep, you name it, nothing he faced could shake his foundation, and none of it could dim his hope of heaven. People who build their hopes on the stock market, a lot of times they'll crash when it crashes. Your health is not a reliable foundation. Our current situation shows us that. Your friends and your family, as much as we love them, they make for shaky foundations. If you've built your hopes on any of the things of this world, you've built your life on a foundation that will ultimately crumble, given enough time. But if you trust Jesus, if you live in obedience to him, and you put your hope in him, life storms may rage against you, but you'll see the sun again, because your foundation won't be shaken. But if you consider carefully the words of Jesus that we just read, you remember that the wise person does more than just hear Jesus' words. The wise person does them too. And that concept is pretty significant. Paul, again, in the book of Romans, his grand presentation of the gospel, he begins that book in Romans 1 verse 5 saying that he received grace and apostleship to bring about more than just faith. Rather, he received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. And then at the other end of the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 16 verse 26, Paul says that the gospel was preached to the world to bring about the obedience of faith. So you see that the book of Romans is bookended by this concept of the obedience of faith. We understand, and correctly so, that grace is freedom from the penalty of sin. And that's good, because we deserve sin's penalty, but we need something better than we deserve. And happily, joyfully, God's grace frees us from the penalty of sin. But we need to remember the rest of the story. We need to remember that God's grace also frees us from the power and the presence and the practice of sin in our lives. And I'm afraid that there's an idea floating around out there that since we're saved by faith in Christ and not works of merit, since we can't earn salvation, what we do doesn't matter. Let's go again to Ephesians chapter 2. We'll read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Verses that we have read, we've referred to on a couple of other occasions in other lessons, but they just keep finding a relevant place in our discussion. In Ephesians 2, verse 8, Paul says, "For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one may boast." So, yes, we're saved by faith. And yet, if we look to the very next verse in the same passage, we'll see that even though we're not saved by what we do, the faith that does save us produces a response in us. Because after Paul has just said that we're saved by faith, he'll then say in Ephesians 2, verse 10, that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. It's God's intention for us to get out and work to do good things. We're God's workmanship, his handiwork. We're created in Christ Jesus for good works. We're saved by faith, but we're created for good works, to walk in them. God has prepared them for us. We're saved by faith, but James will say that if faith is alive, if it's not just a lifeless corpse, true faith, living faith, works. James 2, verse 17. Let's go to the Epistle of James. James 2, verse 17, James says, "In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds." So you see, if our faith is authentic, if it's genuine, if it's living, it leads us to obedience. Paul says in Galatians 5, verse 6, that the only thing which really matters is faith working through love. What matters is not just faith, but faith working in a way that causes us to love, to act for the good of others and for the glory of God. Furthermore, Paul tells us in Titus 2, verse 14, that Jesus redeemed us for himself as a people who are to be zealous for good works, psyched about good works, excited about them. Paul says in Titus 3, verse 8, that we are to be careful to devote ourselves to good works. And as for faith alone, if we go back to James chapter 2, let's see what just believing and not doing anything about what we believe accomplishes. In James 2, verse 19, James says, "You believe that there is one God." Good. Even the demons believe that. Even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Consider this idea that God said to Abraham for the first time when he was 75, "Hey, I'm going to give you a son, and even though you've never had any children previously by your wife, I'm going to give you a son, and I'm going to make a great nation from that son." And then later on, when that son, 25 years later, is born, and when he grows up to be a teenager, then God turns around and says, "Hey, Abraham, I want you to offer that boy to me as a burnt offering." And Abraham reasons, well, God said he was going to make a nation out of that boy, and God isn't lying to me. He hasn't lied. And so Abraham's reasoning based on Hebrews chapter 11 was that even if God has to bring that boy back from the dead to keep his promise, he will make good on his word. I can trust God to do what he asks no matter what. And that is living faith. That is the obedience of faith. Joseph trusted God enough to obey him come what may. Bad things happened to him. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. He was falsely accused. He was thrown into prison. And Jacob had something glowing. He had glowing words to say about his son Joseph. Let's go to Genesis 49. Genesis 49, verse beginning in verse 22, here's what Jacob says about his son Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arms stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. So consider this concept. God was the spring that Joseph planted himself beside, because no matter what, Joseph chose to obey God. And so no matter what Joseph faced, the droughts of life didn't destroy him, didn't cause him to wither up. He remained green and fruitful. God saw Joseph through, if you will, the valley of the shadow of death, because Joseph built his house on the rock. He trusted God enough to obey him, and so life's storms didn't destroy him. And furthermore, God lifted Joseph up to be the second most powerful man in one of the most powerful nations in the world. So build your life upon the rock. Hear the words of Jesus and then do them. And let what you do complete what you believe. Now, obedient faith won't keep bad things from happening to you. But in Christ, even the thing that kills you can't destroy you. Consider what Paul says in Philippians, as we've made reference to in previous lessons recently. Philippians is Paul's treatise. It's Paul's great work on joy that Paul ironically writes from a prison cell. And yet, no matter what his circumstances, Paul can know joy because his joy is not dependent upon circumstances. Philippians chapter 1, verse 20, Paul writes, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, and here's the great win-win, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. So build your house upon the rock. Hear Jesus' words, know them, and do them. Live by them. And if you do, you'll still face challenges and adverse circumstances. Life storms will buffet you, as we're all being buffeted by a storm right now. But if you hear the words of Jesus, know them, and do them, no matter what you face, for you to live as Christ, to die as gain. So no matter what you face, you'll stand firm.